But soon they realized that behind the doors of the house lay a secret that could turn their lives upside down. Subscribe and write in the comments where you are watching us from. Michael and Anna had never known the comfort of stability. Their lives, ever since they had first met, had been a long stretch of compromises, borrowed money, and restless nights spent wondering how they would survive the month ahead. They were young, still in their 20s, and their faces carried the softness of youth, but their eyes already reflected a fatigue usually seen in much older people. Their apartment was a single cramped room in the corner of a decaying building, its plaster peeling in long strips, the ceiling patched with boards that sagged dangerously when it rained. The neighbors upstairs argued every night, their voices echoing through the thin walls, and the pipes rattled whenever anyone tried to shower. It was not a place where dreams were supposed to grow, but for lack of anything better, it had become their reluctant home. Michael worked whenever he could find something, carrying crates in a warehouse, loading trucks on the edge of the city, sometimes delivering food for a few dollars in tips. Nothing lasted long, nothing paid enough. Anna tried her hand at small freelance projects, designing, painting, cleaning, waiting tables when she was lucky enough to find a place that would hire her. Some months they were forced to choose between paying rent and buying groceries, and they often survived on noodles, stale bread, and whatever vegetables could be found on discount at the corner market. Their clothes were worn, their shoes thin, and though they laughed sometimes to ease the burden, both of them knew how precarious everything had become. Yet in that gray struggle they carried one stubborn dream. Every evening when they sat together at the cracked table in their apartment, they spoke about the idea of a house. Not just any house, but a place that was theirs, where they could breathe without hearing the shouts of strangers through the walls, without the smell of mold creeping from the bathroom, without the humiliation of landlords banging on the door, demanding money they did not have. They wanted a little space, maybe a small garden, somewhere they could plant a tree and watch it grow. It seemed almost foolish given their circumstances, but the dream became their ritual, a way of reminding themselves that life might one day be more than an endless cycle of bills and worries. One late night, while Anna scrolled idly through her phone, she stumbled upon something unusual, an advertisement for an auction of old properties in rural areas. Most of the listings were broken, half-faded images of houses that looked as if they had been forgotten by time itself. Roofs collapsed, windows boarded, paint stripped by decades of neglect. Yet the prices startled her. They were astonishingly low, far below anything even resembling a normal house in the city. At first she laughed, assuming there must be some trick, but curiosity led her to click through the listings, and her laughter faded into silence as the images grew stranger. Michael leaned over her shoulder, his eyes narrowing as he read. A 2-story farmhouse for less than the cost of a year's rent. A cabin with acres of land, sold as is, but still standing. And then buried near the end, a peculiar entry, a 200-year-old estate, partially collapsed, requiring full renovation. The photograph was grainy, taken from a distance, but they could make out the outline of a large building rising from behind a curtain of trees, its roof jagged, its windows dark. The caption was almost dismissive. Historic property, structural concerns. Buyer assumes all risk. Michael's heart gave a strange flutter. The historian in him, the boy who had once loved walking through old neighborhoods and imagining the lives of those who had come before, felt an immediate pull. But the practical man, the one who counted every cent and measured every risk, tried to silence the thought. They had nothing. They could not even afford a new couch, much less an ancient mansion falling apart in the countryside. Still, the photograph lingered in his mind like a whisper that refused to leave. The night of the auction came faster than either of them expected. They sat together in the dim glow of their old laptop, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence as they watched property after property flash across the screen. The atmosphere of the auction was surreal. Names of bidders scrolled in real time, numbers climbing with dizzying speed, homes changing hands in a matter of seconds. Small cottages vanished to other buyers before Michael could even consider a bid. Farms with wide fields disappeared just as quickly. Their hope was thinning, and Anna had already begun to close the laptop when the photograph of the estate appeared. Michael's hand moved almost without thought. He clicked to place a bid. His heart lurched the instant he did it, his stomach tightening with panic. He had set a strict limit, barely enough to be considered, and he expected the number to be swept away instantly. But the seconds ticked, the price held, and then a sharp message appeared across the screen. "Congratulations, you have won." For a moment, neither of them breathed. Anna's face drained of color. "Which one is it?" she asked, her voice nearly a whisper. Michael clicked for details and the image enlarged. The massive 200-year-old mansion, its facade draped in vines, its roof sagging, its front porch buried in weeds. The description was short, almost cruel in its bluntness. Unstable structure, property abandoned for decades, buyer assumes full liability. No returns. They sat frozen, staring at the screen as if it had betrayed them. The money had already left their account. There was no undoing it. Michael tried to laugh, but the sound came hollow. Anna buried her face in her hands. "What have we done?" The following week became a blur. They sold what little they owned that could not be carried, crammed the rest into an old rented van, and left behind the city that had drained them for so long. As the skyline shrank in the rearview mirror, Anna stared silently out the window, her expression unreadable. Michael gripped the wheel tightly, trying to ignore the fear crawling up his spine. Each mile carried them further into the unknown, away from the noise of the city and into a countryside that seemed to whisper of forgotten things. The landscape changed gradually. Highways melted into narrower roads. Buildings gave way to fields. Fields dissolved into woods. They passed through towns so small they seemed more like memories than places where people still lived. Old gas stations, diners with peeling signs, houses sagging under the weight of neglect. At each stop, eyes followed them, suspicious, curious, perhaps pitying. When Michael mentioned the address of the estate, more than one local raised an eyebrow but said nothing, turning away with lips pressed tight. At last they found the road that wound through the trees toward their new home. The van shuddered over roots and potholes until suddenly the mansion revealed itself at the end of the drive. Both of them gasped, though for different reasons. It was enormous, looming like a skeletal giant against the gray sky. Its windows were black hollows, some boarded, some cracked. The porch sagged under its own weight. One shutter swung on a single hinge. Vines and weeds consumed the facade, as if nature itself was trying to bury the structure in silence. The air was heavy, unmoving, filled with the scent of damp earth and old wood. Neither of them spoke as Michael parked the van. They sat there staring at the house, caught between awe and dread. Anna finally whispered, "It looks haunted." Michael tried to smile, but his throat was dry. Haunted or not, it was theirs. And as they stepped out of the van, the crunch of dead leaves beneath their feet sounded like the beginning of a story they could not yet imagine. A story that would lead them into the heart of the mansion's secrets. A story where poverty and ruin would twist into the promise of wealth and the weight of a legacy darker than either of them had known. The first night in the mansion was as unsettling as both of them had feared. They laid their sleeping bags out in the vast front hall, the space so cavernous that their small lantern threw only thin islands of light into the sea of darkness around them. The air was heavy with the smell of damp wood, mildew, and dust that had not been disturbed for decades. Every movement echoed strangely, as though the walls themselves were listening. Anna pulled her blanket close around her shoulders, and Michael kept glancing upward, to the high ceilings where shadows seemed to gather in corners, like watchful eyes. Neither of them slept much. Their exhaustion finally dragged them into fitful dreams, only to be startled awake by sudden groans from the beams above or the sharp crack of shifting wood. By morning, they both felt as if they had aged years overnight. Michael rose before Anna, his back aching from the hard boards beneath him, and pushed open the massive front doors. Outside, the light was pale, and the air was cold, filled with the scent of wet grass and earth. The ground stretched wild and unkempt, weeds as tall as his waist, vines coiling like snakes around the porch columns. He stood for a long moment, breathing slowly, trying to shake off the lingering sense of dread. When Anna joined him, they sat together on the steps with 2 tin cups of instant coffee, their words sparse, their gazes locked on the decaying giant that now belonged to them. In the daylight, the house looked even larger, its wounds clearer. Broken windows, loose shingles, cracks running down its chimneys. Yet there was also a strange majesty about it, a dignity that had not been erased by time. Michael finally spoke, his voice rough. "We should see what we're dealing with." Anna only nodded, but her eyes remained fixed on the broken porch railings. Neither of them wanted to admit out loud that they were afraid. Still, they gathered their flashlights, gloves, and cheap paper masks, then stepped back inside. The interior greeted them like the hollowed shell of a memory. Dust hung in the air, disturbed by their footsteps, and the wood beneath them groaned as if reluctant to bear weight again. The front hall stretched into shadow, its once grand staircase darkened with grime. They moved slowly, prying open stuck doors, each room revealing a different piece of forgotten grandeur. In what had once been the parlor, heavy velvet curtains still clung stubbornly to their rods, riddled with holes left by moths. A grand piano stood crooked in the corner, its surface cracked, its keys warped and yellowed. Anna pressed one gently, and the sound it produced was a dull clunk, a hollow echo of music long lost. The dining room was worse. A portion of the ceiling had collapsed, spilling plaster and wooden laths across a long table that was still, unbelievably, set as if for a meal. Shattered dishes and broken glasses lay scattered among the debris. The sight made Anna shiver, the frozen image of a feast interrupted decades earlier, abandoned in a moment of disaster. In the kitchen, the air was rank with mildew. Water stains streaked the walls from leaks that had never been repaired, and the cabinets sagged under their own weight. The sink was clogged with rust, and the floorboards were warped from years of rot. "What happened here?" Anna murmured, though Michael did not answer. He was staring at the ornate banister of the main staircase. Beneath the filth, the craftsmanship was still visible. Delicate carvings and flourishes that spoke of a time when wealth had filled this place. He touched it with a strange reverence, imagining guests in evening clothes once climbing those steps, servants carrying trays, children sliding down its polished rail. But the warmth of those images quickly faded into the present reality. Cold, emptiness, decay. They moved onward, deeper into the house. At the end of a hallway, they found a narrow door warped by dampness. Michael forced it open, and the hinges shrieked in protest. A chill wafted up from the darkness beyond. The air smelled of earth and mold, heavy and damp. Flashlights pierced the blackness, revealing a narrow staircase descending into the basement. Michael went first, Anna reluctantly following, her hand gripping his shoulder as if to anchor herself. The basement floor was packed dirt, uneven and littered with broken crates and rusted tools. Cobwebs thick as curtains hung from the beams. Against one wall stood an old wooden trunk, its iron fittings flaking with rust. Michael knelt, brushed away the webs, and pried it open. Inside lay yellowed papers, faded photographs, and small objects wrapped in cloth. He lifted a photograph and froze. A group posed in front of the mansion looked back at him, a stern white family in early 20th century finery, flanked by several black servants. One of those servants bore an uncanny resemblance to Michael, the same jawline, the same eyes. Anna leaned over his shoulder, whispering, "He looks like you." "Ah," Michael swallowed hard. "It's just coincidence." But even as he said it, his voice trembled. He shuffled through the rest of the trunk, letters written in delicate cursive, brittle property records, receipts, names repeated again and again. Patterson, the family who had owned the estate, and among the servants' names was one that stopped him cold. Sarah Johnson, his grandmother's name. The dates were from 1912, 1913. Anna stared at him, her eyes wide. "Michael." He folded one letter carefully and slipped it into his pocket. "We'll look into it later." His chest was tight, his heart pounding, but he forced himself to move on. They climbed the steps back into the house, though neither spoke. As they continued exploring, Anna noticed something strange. On several door frames and windowsills, faint carvings had been etched into the wood, symbols that looked like crude stars, crossed lines, and looping patterns. She traced one with her fingertip and shivered. "What do you think these are?" Michael examined one closely. "Protective marks. People used to carve symbols to ward off evil or bad luck." The words hung uneasily in the air as they moved on. By late afternoon, they had covered most of the main floor and cautiously ventured upstairs. The bedrooms were like time capsules. Wallpaper peeled in yellowed strips, iron bed frames rusted, old trunks spilled forgotten clothes. One room still held a vanity, its mirror cracked but intact. Anna paused before it, her reflection fractured. For just an instant, she thought she saw movement behind her, a flicker of a figure standing in the corner. She spun around, heart racing, but the room was empty. She said nothing to Michael. That evening they returned to the front hall, too exhausted to continue. They unrolled their sleeping bags, the lantern casting long shadows that seemed to crawl across the walls. The carved symbols on the wood appeared to shift when seen from the corner of the eye. They ate cold sandwiches, spoke in low voices, and tried to ignore the sense that the house was listening. When at last Anna drifted into uneasy sleep, Michael lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He thought he heard whispers, faint and distant, like voices in another room. He told himself it was the wind funneling through the broken chimneys, yet he could not shake the image of the man in the photograph who looked so much like him. He turned toward Anna, holding her hand tightly. Somewhere in the depths of the house, something creaked, followed by the soft, deliberate sound of footsteps. Michael froze, listening, his pulse racing. The mansion groaned like an old beast stirring in its sleep. When morning came, pale light creeping through the boarded windows. Both of them looked exhausted, pale from lack of rest. But Michael's resolve had only sharpened. Today they would search further. Today they would begin to understand what kind of house this was, what history lived in its walls, and why it felt as though every corner of it was watching. The house was no longer just a ruin. It was waking, slowly, cautiously, and it seemed to know that they had disturbed its long silence. The third morning dawned gray and heavy, with clouds pressed low over the fields, and a silence that seemed to deepen every sound. Anna woke to the smell of coffee and found Michael already sitting at the makeshift table they had set up in the hall. His eyes were fixed on the faded photograph he had carried from the basement trunk, his thumb brushing over the face of the servant who looked so much like him. She watched him from the doorway, feeling the weight of what they had found pressing down upon them, then crossed the creaking floor to sit beside him. For a moment they did not speak, their silence carrying all the questions they had no answers for. Michael's expression was tense, almost haunted. "I can't stop thinking about it," he finally admitted. His voice was low, as though afraid the house itself might overhear. "That man, Sarah Johnson's name in the letters? My grandmother used to tell stories about her grandmother, who worked in a big house down south. I never thought much of it. But what if this is it? What if this house is part of my family's history?" Anna felt a shiver run through her at the thought. If it was true, if this decaying mansion was linked to Michael's bloodline, then it meant they were standing not only in ruins, but in a living fragment of his own past. She touched the edge of the photograph gently. If it is, then this place isn't just a burden. It's part of you, part of your story. Later that morning, they drove into the town they had passed through earlier. The library was small, tucked into a squat brick building that looked almost as old as the houses around it. Inside, the air was stale, filled with the scent of dust and brittle paper. Michael immediately sought out the history section, pulling whatever he could find about the town and its landmarks. Anna drifted between the shelves, fingers trailing over the spines of books, until she was startled by a voice behind her. "You're the ones who bought the Patterson place, aren't you?" She turned to see an elderly woman with sharp eyes peering at her over half-moon glasses. Anna hesitated, then nodded. The woman's expression shifted to something unreadable. "My mother used to tell me stories about that house," she said softly. "Said it was cursed. People went missing there. The Pattersons themselves disappeared one night. Some say they ran off. Others—" She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Others say their servants rose up and took revenge. But nobody ever proved it. After that, nobody stayed there long. The house wouldn't let them." Anna's stomach tightened at the words. She asked carefully if the woman knew anything about the servants who had lived there, but the old woman only shook her head. "There might be census logs, maybe old land records, but people don't like talking about it. Too much bad blood. She gestured toward Michael, who was already buried in a stack of books and newspapers. That one's digging in the right place. By the time they returned to the mansion, Michael carried a folder thick with photocopies. They spread them across the floor of the hall, kneeling together as they sifted through brittle records and faded images. Many of the names were familiar by now, the Pattersons listed as owners, rows of servants and farmhands beneath them. And there, again and again, was Sarah Johnson. The name leapt out at Michael like a heartbeat. She was here, he whispered. This was her life. The knowledge settled heavily on them. The house was no longer simply a mistake, no longer just an unwanted burden. It was a place that had held Michael's ancestors in bondage, a place where his bloodline had labored and suffered. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, they began to explore the grounds beyond the mansion. The grass was waist-high, tangled with weeds and vines. Anna stumbled first upon the edge of a stone half-buried beneath ivy. She knelt, tugged at the vines, and revealed the weathered face of a headstone leaning crookedly. "Michael," she called, her voice tight. He hurried to her side, and together they cleared more vines, uncovering several more stones. Their inscriptions were worn, but the names were still legible. Servants, laborers, children. At the center stood a small crypt, its door sealed shut with rusted iron. Michael's breath caught as he read the most prominent stone. The name carved there was unmistakable. Sarah Johnson, 1868-1920. He knelt before it, his fingers tracing the letters as if they might dissolve beneath his touch. It was proof, carved into stone, that his grandmother's stories had been real. Anna rested a hand gently on his shoulder. "She's here," she whispered. He could only nod, his throat too tight to form words. The discovery of the graves changed everything. The house no longer felt like an empty ruin. It felt like a monument to lives endured, to suffering that had been buried but never forgotten. That night, as they lay again in their sleeping bags, neither could sleep. The walls creaked and shifted. The beams groaned as though under invisible weight. Anna swore she heard faint footsteps pacing slowly above them, though they had locked every door. At one point she jolted awake, convinced she heard a woman's voice humming, a lullaby so faint it seemed to drift through the floorboards. She lay still, eyes wide, heart hammering, unable to tell if it was a dream or something else. The next morning Michael returned to the trunk in the basement, digging deeper through its contents. Beneath loose papers and broken trinkets, he found a small bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon. The handwriting was delicate, slanted, but the name at the bottom of each letter made his chest tighten. Sarah Johnson. He unfolded them with trembling hands. Most were brief, written to her children and their children after them. She described long days of work, the endless labor, the dreams she dared not speak aloud. One letter stopped him cold. The ink trailed as though written with shaking hands. "This house has seen too much pain, but I pray there will come a time when our blood walks these halls not as servants, but as masters, reclaiming what was taken from us." Michael read the words aloud, his voice breaking. Anna leaned against him, staring at the fragile paper. "It's like she's speaking to you," she whispered. He folded the letter carefully, as if it were a living thing, and placed it back in the bundle. "Maybe she is." From that day forward, the house no longer seemed merely cursed. It felt purposeful, as though Sarah's words had called them here. Yet the deeper their connection grew, the more restless the nights became. Whispers grew clearer, faint humming returned, and shadows flickered at the edge of vision. Anna began to see figures in mirrors, fleeting glimpses of women in long dresses, men in work clothes. Michael, too, felt it, an unseen presence that lingered near whenever he walked the halls. And then came the discovery that would alter everything. While clearing debris in what they thought was only a storage room off the library, Michael noticed a faint draft. He pressed his hand against the wall and found the source, a section paneled with dark wood that sounded hollow when struck. He called for Anna, and together they searched the seams until they found a nearly invisible gap. It was a concealed door. Michael fetched a crowbar and pried it open. Dust swirled in the stale air as the panel shifted, revealing a narrow passage. Their flashlights cut through the blackness, beams catching dust motes that drifted like ghosts. At the far end stood another door, plain but solid, its iron handle rusted. Michael hesitated, Sarah's final letter echoing in his mind. The truth of us lies hidden in the room they could not find. The handle resisted at first, then groaned open. The door swung inward to reveal a chamber untouched by decay. Time itself seemed to have paused here. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with boxes, books, jars of yellowed paper. In the center stood a simple wooden table. Atop it lay a ledger, its leather cracked but intact. Anna's breath caught audibly. It's like it's been waiting. Michael approached slowly, his pulse pounding. The pages of the ledger were filled with neat handwriting, dates spanning years. At first they seemed to be lists of supplies and wages, but as he turned the pages, the entries shifted. Paragraphs replaced numbers, written in Sarah's own hand. He read aloud, each word filling the room with a gravity that silenced them both. She had chronicled everything. The endless labor, the punishments, the quiet defiance whispered in the shadows. Her words carried both pain and strength, a voice that refused to be erased. As Michael read, Anna moved to one of the shelves. She opened a box and found photographs. Men and women in work clothes, standing in clusters near the outbuildings, their faces weary but unbowed. Among them was Sarah herself, her gaze sharp and unflinching. Other boxes held relics of life long past, a tarnished silver brooch, worn gloves, a child's dress carefully folded. Each artifact was a fragment of truth that had been buried for generations. At last they found a letter unlike the others, tucked beneath the child's dress. Michael unfolded it with shaking hands. The ink was faded, but the words were clear. If you read this, you are mine, my blood, my kin. This house was our burden and our bondage, but it shall be our reclamation. We rose that night, not for vengeance alone, but so our children might stand here one day unchained. Let no one bury our truth again. Michael's breath caught, and he sank into the lone chair at the table. He could almost see it now, the night of revolt, the hurried steps in darkened halls, the fear of the Pattersons, the determination of the servants. The mystery of the family's disappearance was no mystery at all. It was rebellion, and Sarah had ensured their story would not be lost. For a long time, neither spoke. The lantern light flickered against the walls, shadows dancing like the ghosts of those who had lived and died here. Anna finally placed her hand on Michael's, her voice steady. She wrote it for you, for all of you. Michael nodded slowly, tears stinging his eyes. And now it's ours to finish. They did not enter further that night. They stood in the doorway of the hidden room, staring as though afraid to cross its threshold, knowing that in some way everything had already changed. When they finally returned to the front hall, the mansion loomed behind them with a new weight. It was no longer merely a ruin. It was alive with memory, and it had chosen to reveal its truth. The days that followed their discovery of Sarah's hidden room seemed to blur together, each one saturated with a sense of weight and purpose neither of them had ever felt before. The letters in the ledger were still spread across the makeshift table in the hall, as though Sarah herself had arranged them there. Michael read from them every morning, his voice quiet but steady, the words settling into him like commands. Anna found herself treating the chamber almost like a shrine. She moved carefully within it, touching objects as though they were sacred, each artifact a remnant of the people who had once filled these walls with their lives. The house was no longer an empty ruin to her eyes, but something alive, throbbing with memory. Yet with this recognition came an invisible shift, a change that neither she nor Michael could easily explain. The mansion, it seemed, had begun to test them. At first it was subtle. A section of ceiling collapsed suddenly one afternoon, sending plaster and dust raining down only inches from where Anna had been standing. Michael rushed to her side, his hands clutching her shoulders as he pulled her away, both of them coughing in the haze. "I didn't even touch it," she whispered, wide-eyed, trembling. He soothed her, but as he brushed plaster from her hair, he could not escape the thought that the house had chosen that moment, that exact instant, as if to remind them it held power. Money was dwindling faster than they could manage. Each trip into town drained what little remained in their accounts. Nails, tarps, wood, all far more expensive than either of them had calculated. They ate noodles night after night, shared cans of beans over the camp stove, sold anything of personal value to stretch their resources. Anna parted with two of her paintings, works that had taken her months to complete, boxed and sent to strangers for a fraction of their worth. Michael pawned his old guitar, an instrument he had carried since college, telling himself he would one day buy it back. They began to live on the knife edge between determination and desperation. The townspeople, once cold and suspicious, seemed to waver in their view. Some still muttered in the diner, loud enough for Anna to overhear. "Why bother? That place should have been torn down years ago." Another woman whispered harshly, "They'll never last the winter." But occasionally small kindnesses slipped through. The hardware store clerk slipped an extra box of nails into Michael's bag without charging him. A young man from the lumber yard offered to help them carry supplies to their van. And once an older farmer arrived at their gate with a bundle of wood, simply dropping it near the porch without a word. These moments of help were fragile and fleeting, but they carried the sense that their struggle was being watched with something other than disdain. Inside the house, the resistance deepened. Doors they had left ajar slammed shut when they turned their backs. At night, the humming Anna had once dismissed as imagination returned, drifting through the halls like a melody that was not meant for the living. Michael swore he heard whispers just beyond the edge of hearing, words too faint to grasp but heavy with intent. The air grew colder at odd times, the light dimming inexplicably even during the day. One night, Anna jolted awake to find Michael sitting upright, his eyes fixed on the stairs. When she whispered his name, he said nothing, only kept staring. Later, he confessed he thought he had seen someone there, a figure watching from the landing, silent and still. The strain began to seep into their relationship. They snapped at each other over trivial things, the cost of supplies, whose turn it was to haul water from town, how to divide their work. Anna accused Michael of becoming obsessed with Sarah's letters, reading them until the lantern burned low while she lay awake in the dark. He countered that she did not understand, that this was not just about restoring a house, but reclaiming something larger, something that belonged to them both. Their arguments flared and cooled, leaving them drained, yet always they circled back to one truth. They could not leave. Whether it was pride, determination, or the invisible pull of Sarah's words, they were bound to the house. It was during one of their cleaning sessions in the library that the mansion revealed another of its secrets. Michael had been hauling debris from a corner when he noticed a faint draft again, different from the concealed passage they had already found. His fingers traced along the paneling until he struck a hollow section. Excitement mixed with dread surged through him as he called for Anna. Together they pressed in pride until a section gave way, revealing a narrow cavity. Inside were ledgers, photographs, and bundles of documents wrapped in cloth. They carried them carefully to the table in the hall. The photographs were stiff and formal, portraits of the Patterson family in elegant clothing, their faces pale and stern. But beneath them lay something else, papers written in shaky hands, journals scrawled with fear and resentment. As Michael read them, the truth unfolded like a wound reopening. The Pattersons had grown paranoid toward the end. Rumors of unrest among the servants had filled the household. Punishments had become harsher, rules stricter. One journal, in the hand of Mr. Patterson himself, recorded sleepless nights, his hand always near the pistol at his side. He wrote of shadows in the halls, of whispers he could not silence. He suspected betrayal, though he could never name it. Anna read over his shoulder, her face pale. "They knew," she whispered. "They knew something was coming." Among the journals was a final entry, brief and abrupt. "Tonight we shall put an end to it. They will learn what happens when loyalty is broken." It was dated only a day before the family disappeared. The discovery shook them both. The story that had been shrouded in rumor, the mysterious vanishing of the Pattersons, was no mystery at all. It was violence. It was rebellion. Sarah's letters had told them as much, but here was confirmation, written in the trembling hand of the oppressors themselves. That night, sleep was impossible. The wind battered the shutters, the walls moaned with each gust, and the sound of the storm outside seemed to seep into the house itself. Michael paced the hall while Anna sat rigid in her blanket, the lantern flickering between them. At one point, the light dimmed so low she thought it would go out, only to flare back stronger, casting long shadows up the staircase. And in those shadows, she thought she saw movement figures leaning forward, reaching, waiting. The storm raged until the early hours of the morning, and with it came the culmination of everything they had felt building. Doors slammed of their own accord, unseen footsteps ran across the upstairs hall, and the humming rose louder, a mournful song threading through the wind. At the height of it, when thunder shook the foundations, Anna cried out as a mirror in the dining room shattered, its glass spraying across the floor. Michael grabbed her, pulling her close, his own fear hidden behind clenched teeth. When at last the storm subsided, silence fell with a weight so heavy it pressed into their chests. They sat together in the hall, trembling, eyes wide, listening to the last creaks of the settling house. The mansion had made its message clear. It was not simply theirs to take. Every scrap of wealth, every fragment of history, every glimmer of promise came with a cost. They could feel it now with every breath. The house would not give without demanding in return. And somewhere, deep inside the walls, the past was waiting, restless and unquiet, as though the rebellion of long ago had never ended, and the house itself demanded a reckoning. The morning after the storm was dim and colorless, the light filtering through the broken shutters like water seeping through cracks in stone. The mansion stood silent but tense, its great timbers groaning now and then, as though they too were catching their breath after the night's fury. Michael and Anna moved like ghosts through the front hall, collecting shards of glass from the shattered mirror, brushing plaster from the floor where another section of ceiling had given way. Neither of them spoke. The silence was heavy not only with exhaustion, but with the knowledge that the house had crossed some invisible threshold. It was no longer simply pressing its presence upon them. It was demanding something. Michael lingered by the table where Sarah's letters and the Patterson journals lay spread in a chaotic scatter. He traced his finger over Sarah's handwriting, remembering the words she had written for those who would come after her, for children who might one day reclaim what was taken. He thought of the graves outside, the name carved into stone, the promise etched into her letter. Anna came to stand beside him, her face pale but resolute. "We can't go on like this," she said quietly. "The house won't let us." Michael looked at her, and for the first time he admitted what he had been afraid to say aloud. "It wants something from us, not just to rebuild it, not just to live here. It wants us to acknowledge what happened, to carry it forward." They turned together toward the grounds later that day, drawn by the memory of the crypt they had uncovered near the ancient oak. The weeds still choked its base, ivy climbing across the stone as though to hide it. The iron door was rusted shut, but Michael's crowbar pried it loose with a screech that echoed through the still air. Inside, the air was damp and stale. Narrow stone steps descended into darkness, their flashlights cutting weak beams that revealed walls lined with niches. Some held remains sealed in crumbling coffins. Others were nothing but hollow recesses, the wood long since decayed to dust. At the center stood a stone sarcophagus, its lid cracked but intact. The inscription was faint yet legible. "To those who remain, remember us." Anna knelt before it, her voice trembling as she whispered the words. Michael placed his hand on the lid, his palm cold against the stone. He felt no movement, no breath, but there was a weight in the silence, a pressure that made his chest tighten. It was as though the air itself waited for him to speak. Back in the mansion that evening, they sat at the table with lantern light flickering across their weary faces. Michael spread Sarah's letters before them, then added the Patterson journals alongside. Two stories written in different hands, two truths that collided in this house. He began to read them aloud in turns. Sarah's words of toil and defiance, Patterson's words of fear and suspicion. The sound of the two voices braided together seemed to change the air around them. Anna sat very still, listening, her eyes fixed on him, as though she too felt the mansion leaning closer to hear. That night the house stirred more forcefully than ever before. The wind rose again, though outside the skies were clear. Doors shuddered on their hinges, floorboards creaked under unseen steps, and the faint humming returned, louder now, a song threaded with both sorrow and strength. Anna clutched Michael's arm as the lantern guttered, shadows lunging across the walls. He held her hand tightly, refusing to let the fear break him. "We have to finish it," he whispered. "We have to give them their truth." The next day they returned to the hidden room behind the library. The chamber greeted them with its preserved stillness, its shelves lined with artifacts and photographs, its table still bearing the ledger Sarah had written. Michael carried with him a notebook of his own. He sat at the table and began to write, his pen scratching across the paper in slow, deliberate strokes. He copied passages from Sarah's letters, from the journals, but he also added his own words. He wrote of who they were, of how they had come to this place, of the connection that bound them to the house. Anna added her own voice, filling pages with her impressions, her fears, and her determination that Sarah's story should not vanish again. When they left the room hours later, both felt a subtle shift in the air. The oppressive weight that had hung upon their shoulders seemed lighter, though the silence of the house was still thick with watchfulness. Outside, the graves no longer seemed abandoned. Anna gathered wildflowers from the tangled yard and placed them gently against Sarah's headstone, whispering thanks as she did so. Michael stood beside her, his jaw tight, his eyes wet though he tried to hide it. The weeks that followed were grueling, but the work took on a different meaning. They rebuilt not only for themselves, but for those who had come before. Michael patched roofs and braced walls with a determination that bordered on devotion, while Anna restored the garden, uncovering old stone paths and benches, coaxing order from the chaos. Each nail driven, each weed uprooted, felt like an act of remembrance. Their exhaustion was immense, but beneath it ran a current of strength that neither had known before. Word spread in town of the progress they were making. Neighbors who once muttered now stopped them in the store to ask questions. Some offered advice, others supplies. A few even came to the gates of the estate, peering in with cautious curiosity, though none dared step inside. The mansion, once a symbol of ruin and fear, was becoming something different. Yet always when Michael and Anna returned at night, the house reminded them of its presence. The whispers had not ceased, but they no longer carried the same menace. Instead, they seemed to guide, to steady, as though unseen hands were helping them carry the weight. One evening, as the sun set in crimson and gold, Michael stood at the top of the newly repaired roof, gazing across the land. The fields stretched in rolling green, the crypt's dark outline visible beneath the oak. For the first time since they had arrived, he felt not crushed by the size of the place, but anchored by it. This was no longer just a ruin. It was home. Anna joined him later, her hand slipping into his as they looked together at the mansion, its windows catching the glow of twilight. "It doesn't feel cursed anymore," she said softly. "It feels claimed." Michael nodded, his chest tight with emotion. "It chose us," he answered. Months later, when the restoration had reached a point where guests could be invited, Michael wrote to his extended family. He told them of Sarah, of the letters, of the truth long hidden in the walls of a house they had never known. Many of them arrived curious, skeptical, but when they walked the halls and heard Michael read aloud Sarah's words, when they stood by the crypt and saw the names carved into stone, their faces changed. Tears fell, hands gripped his shoulders, and a quiet reverence filled the air. That night, lanterns burned in every window of the mansion, their glow spilling across the grounds. Family gathered in the great hall, voices low with awe and memory. Michael and Anna stood together, hand in hand, their faces illuminated by the warm light. The mansion no longer felt like a burden pressing upon them, but like a presence standing with them, its long-suppressed history finally given voice. Later, as the guests departed and the night grew quiet, Michael stepped onto the porch and gazed at the house. The old timbers no longer groaned with hostility. The windows reflected the stars like calm, watchful eyes. He felt Sarah's presence not as a restless ghost, but as a guardian finally at peace. He whispered into the night, "We remembered you," and the house, in its silence, seemed to breathe. If you were hooked by this story, don't miss what's coming next. Hit subscribe now and turn on the bell so you'll be the first to know when new secrets are revealed. Watch our other incredible stories right here on the channel and share this video with your friends. You won't believe what's waiting for them.